Hello, everyone. My name is Altaf. I'm the chair for the branch. Today, our talk is about protecting and defending our data. We all know data is key, and we know the risk of data loss is also very high today. Are we confident our data is protected? What are we doing, or what should we actually be doing? So Paul and David will be talking about protecting and defending our data in today's talk. Paul Sipko is a partner with Adapter Consulting, a specialist firm of consultants that work mainly with the not-for-profit sector, having led assignments of more than 100 organizations. David is a senior consultant with Adapter, specializing in the charity governance, risk management, and the use of IT to drive their objectives. I'm now going to hand over to Paul and David. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So hopefully we've got the presentation loaded up. So thank you, Alta, for the great introduction there. As mentioned, I'm one of the partners in Adapter Consulting, specialist firm of consultants that works almost entirely in the not-for-profit sector. So during the course of this little talk, we'll be taking some of our experiences in the not-for-profit sector to the world more generally. Obviously there's David as well, who's now a principal consultant. So in terms of what we'll be covering, we'll just spend a few moments on introductions and practicalities. Then we'll spend maybe 10 minutes or so setting the scene about cybersecurity. I think sometimes with this, it's very easy to sort of accept it as being important because a lot of us on this call today live and breathe this kind of thing all the time, but particularly when we're engaging with colleagues who perhaps have less of a data or IT or digital type focus, it can sometimes be helpful to almost put ourselves in their shoes and sort of understand sort of why this should be important to them as well. We'll then have a look at the types of breaches that often happen, how they come about, and some of the common misconceptions about how they come about. And then at that point, I'll hand over to David, who'll be considering kind of life after GDPR. We know most of you have probably had more than enough exposure to data protection and GDPR. However, thinking here specifically about how we can build on some of that to instill good practice in cybersecurity. And then perhaps the most practical point here is looking at some of the first steps in managing cyber risk and protecting data. And also some of the, a whistle-stop tour of some of the popular standards. And then, of course, we open up to question and answer and discussion. So it's going to be very high level as we fly through this. I'm mindful that this is an enormous field in its own right, and there'll be lots of people on this call today who have probably dedicated their entire careers to cyber security, or perhaps even particular aspects of it. So I'm hoping we might learn a thing or two ourselves, as well as being able to share some of our experience with all of you. So I mentioned, I covered this very briefly, this is about Adapter Consulting. So as I mentioned, we're a specialist firm of management and technology consultants that works almost entirely in the not-for-profit sector. So a lot of our clients are basically charities, membership organizations, grant-making organizations, professional associations, and so on. In other words, organizations whose lifeblood is their data. And we're supplier independent, so we kind of look at things from a vendor neutral perspective when we're looking at solutions, and all of our consultants have held senior positions, so we've been on the other side of the fence as well. During the course of this today, we've got some interactive polling that we'll be doing. So I've put there a hyperlink. This is the first time we've used this, so I'm hoping it'll go okay. If it doesn't, we'll just skip over it and move on to the next thing. But we've got a link there. So you may wish to kind of tap that into your web browsers, because we'll be asking a bit later on for people to vote on different things, or to share ideas, and we'll see what comes out of it. And obviously, if you've got any questions as we go through, please do just pop them straight into the chat function. And if they're of a technical nature, as in you're having problems with Zoom or something, somebody from BCS will reply. And if they're questions relating to the subject matter, then we'll handle those when we get to Q&A at the end. So where to start? Well, I was talking with a colleague a couple of weeks ago as we were preparing for this webinar, and you know, I was saying, well, you know, it's a broad topic. Where should we start with all of this? And just as a side thing, he had a bit of a laugh actually, and wished me well with having people turning up to this webinar. And it suddenly dawned on me exactly what he was saying. So I think on this webinar at the moment, we've got the best part of, I don't know the exact number, I think Altaf might know it, but I think 180 registrations. I was doing a conference back in, I think it was 2003, 2004, on a very similar topic, information security. And it was at a well-attended conference. The conference had 4 work streams in it, 4 different breakout sessions. And despite there being about 500 people at that conference, my session ended up with about 3 people turning up. Such was the level of interest in information security. I mean, I guess there could be other reasons as well, but clearly it was not a particularly popular topic. And that experience was not uncommon. My colleague that I was chatting to was recalling almost an identical experience. You know, we had a talk about you know, why that might be so. And I think things have changed since then. People now recognize that cybersecurity, protecting data, isn't just a sort of afterthought to leave to the techies, you know, kind of slightly boring thing that everybody recognizes the importance of, but kind of leaves to somebody else. I think now people are recognizing that it's a crucial thing in its own right, and obviously things like GDPR have contributed to that understanding. I mentioned that we at Adapter do a lot of work with charities, and to illustrate some of the thinking behind this, people think of charities and think, well, you know, they're not going to have a data breach, are they? I mean, surely, firstly, why would anybody bother? I mean, charities have got no money. On the other hand, they might think, and even if they did, who would go after a charity anyway? I mean, you know, such worthy causes. I mean, who would be so heartless? And of course, that is simply not the case at all. You know, the charity sector, for instance, is, you know, we've got this statistic here, you know, £80 billion a year. More than half of charities think cybercrime is a major risk to the sector. You know, we see in other sectors as well. I mean, quite a timely example here about the Colonial Pipeline Company. You know, the impact of that major cyber attack on them affecting, you know, another sector. And as we'll come on to a bit later, a lot of these attacks are automated. They're indiscriminate. It's not necessarily that people are targeting particular types of organizations. Sometimes they just target any type of organization. It's the way malware, ransomware, and such like can spread. So I think the thing here is it's almost false comfort for some organizations to think, well, we're a small organization, or, we haven't got much money. In the eyes of an attacker, A, it might not matter, and B, actually, it could have a counter effect. They may think actually it means the defenses are weaker. I mean, to some extent, if one was looking to attack an organization, to get ransomware or something, would you necessarily go for a well-resourced bank, for instance, which has got lots of money but also huge defenses, or perhaps a small organization which be able to commit quite so much to protecting its data but still has considerable dependence on their data and funds as well? So we've got a little survey at this point. We've got our hyperlink there, and our question is, what worries you most about information security in your organization? So we've just opened up the poll, and it's the first time we've used this, but please do go to that link. Or alternatively, you can go to vvox.app and enter the ID. And I think as you do that, the responses should, with any luck, start coming through. So we'll give this.
Paul, do you want to send that on the chat? If you can send it on the chat, I guess it might.
Yes. Actually, it might be a bit tricky for me to copy and paste the link there, but
I think they're getting some answers, isn't it? Yeah.
So it's setting up a word cloud as we do this. A couple of things in there about, oh wow, quite a few people have said awareness by the looks of it. Ransomware, carelessness, things to do with money. As this is the first in the surveys, we've got about 3 of these surveys, so we'll maybe give this one up to a minute or so for responses to come through. Okay, so we'll leave this poll open, but there's some themes coming through there. So I think the way this word cloud works is the bigger the word, the more people have said that particular word in their response. So awareness is obviously big there. Apathy, and I can see a few other words related to apathy, like uncertainty and human error. We've got ransomware there, so obviously the actual technologies that attackers use quite a big thing. I think at first we had quite a few coming in about financial aspects, engineering costs, I guess sort of having the resources to manage data security properly. Obviously it can be quite resource intensive. Scammers, training, so things related to the people side of things. Shadow IT, again, arguably related to the governance side of things, having proper organizational controls in place. So yeah, thank you for inputting into that. We'll definitely be covering a lot of those topics, actually, especially the awareness one. So if we move on to the next question here, which is, has your organization experienced an information security incident in the past 12 months? So obviously the responses to this are confidential, they're not attributable in any way. Hopefully we can see a bit of a pattern emerging here amongst the branch membership. So we've got some very confident organisations there, a quarter of them or so, that are saying, no, we haven't, and we know that we haven't. We've got somewhat confident, but maybe a fraction unsure, saying we don't think so. And then, what's that, 30%? Best part of 40% in total that have had some kind of incident, ranging from lots of small issues through to a couple that have had them and it's been a big problem. That actually would be consistent with other webinars that we've run and the responses we've had at those webinars also. I mean, the big attacks are less common, but when they do happen, my goodness, they could knock an organisation for six. We also did a survey prior to this to see what was on people's minds, and we were getting similar kinds of things coming through. So a lot of it, I mean, we got all sorts of different responses, but they kind of grouped into three main themes. One theme was around engaging others. Another theme was around products and solutions, so what technology is out there to support data security. And then the next main theme was around what to do. And these really did sort of ask some fundamental questions like, you know, where do we start? Or as a director of the organisation, what should I be asking? So there's clearly a lot of desire for improved awareness, getting others engaged outside of IT, and somehow getting that organisational support to press ahead with things. We've got a few statistics here, mostly from the not-for-profit sector, but I think this is probably not too unrepresentative of the world at large, which was about half of IT leaders have detected ransomware. This data, by the way, comes from the Charity Commission. I think they did a survey of I think it was, no, so some of these are from Sophos, the information security experts. Others are from the Charity Commission, where they did a survey of, I think it was about 15,000 organisations. So about half of IT leaders have had their organisation detect ransomware. About 3/4 have suffered an effective attack. Obviously, that can range from a minor, very minor local thing through to something more significant. Somewhat worryingly, in the charity sector, at least, a third of them don't know what types of cyber attacks they're most vulnerable to. Perhaps even more worrying, half of charities believe the board has overall responsibility for cybersecurity, and 15% say that nobody has clear responsibility. I think those are probably just as bad as each other. Arguably, a board could have accountability for security, but more often than not, these things need named individuals carrying specific responsibilities. Otherwise, things tend not to happen. And there was also this statistic, which is a little bit dated now, about 1 in every 6 charities will suffer from cybercrime. In terms of how it affects them, lots of different ways. The obvious being financially. if it's a ransomware attack, for instance. Reputationally, it doesn't look good to the outside world, especially where you have customers or supporters expecting the organization to keep their data secure. And also in some sectors, it can affect the organization in other ways as well. So if you imagine a charity, it affects their ability to deliver against their calls. If their operations have been disrupted, it may not be about income generation or even reputation, but actually about being able to do what they exist to do. And of course, many commercial sector organizations would be like that as well. Financial and reputation is one thing. Being able to actually get on with what the organization does is another. The breaches can have many different types. So I'm sure lots of us have experienced some of these. The obvious kind of phishing attempts. I came across one the other day where a colleague mentioned to me, because I was getting a lot of just random empty messages, no content in the message itself, but just random words. And I said to him, why would anyone send spam like that? I mean, they're not selling anything. There's nothing attached to it. What's the point? And apparently, with these kinds of attacks, what they're hoping for is that they get an out of office reply bounced back to them. And even better if it's from the finance director or a chief executive or someone with a signature attached, and then they can use that to sort of spoof, so create a sort of message pretending to be from the finance director. They know that person's maybe on holiday. They might email it to somebody in the accounts team that they've on the company's website, and they might say something like, I'm on holiday at the moment, this invoice is way overdue, can you just pay it ASAP please? And somebody might feel pressurized into doing that quickly, and that's how phishing can work, among other different ways. We've got the ransomware things here, where kind of people might open attachments, or somehow some code gets into a network and starts encrypting files. As David had come on to, there are ways of defending against some of that. Some quite technical methods, like journaled file systems, where you can roll back through to, I think it's called immutable backups, where the backups are in a separate network to the main network, so you don't end up with the backups themselves being encrypted. Yeah, it's pretty nasty stuff, and it's very effective as well. Third in this lovely list, extortion. Kind of people collecting the data, having it exfiltrated, and then if there's something sensitive there, they might threaten to release it on the dark web unless they get some kind of ransom payment. We've got DDoS here, so distributed denial of service, where this happens a lot in the charity sector, where perhaps somebody disagrees with the calls and they just want to take the organization down, so they'll overwhelm their servers by typically using a zombie net. So lots of infected machines that they've got control over, they just sort of get those to try and make connections to their target and overwhelm their servers and render them inoperative that way. Social engineering. We don't have a statistic against this one, but I'd have thought this would be by far one of the most common. Just phoning up, pretending to be somebody else. Doesn't necessarily require technical skills to have somebody take a course of action. And one of the best reasons for making sure that staff are well trained and have a high degree of awareness of what some of the common threats are. There's a balance, of course, between sort of healthy cynicism and just outright pessimism with everything. But I think sometimes a little bit of a cynical attitude can be very, very helpful when it comes to IT security. And then our final point here is just plain old accidents. Somebody emails a file to the wrong person. They lose a laptop. There are technical controls, obviously, encryption or outbound mail monitoring and things like that that could be put in place to reduce the chances of that. But again, very easily happens, and to some extent easy to prevent with good training. In terms of who does this, we've got a list there. There's ranging from criminals, just people running scripts, wanting to make some money, through to everything up to kind of nation state hackers. At first, I thought that sounded a bit, the kind of thing you'd expect to only encounter in central government, but actually it's surprisingly common. Some countries, looking to acquire trade secrets, or perhaps, again, in the charity sector, where most of our experience is, a lot of international aid organisations can be subject to government-sponsored activities, as it were. But those are the intentional ones. Unintentionally, it can happen through well-meaning staff who just do something accidentally, suppliers that hold data or process data on behalf of you but suffer their own breach. There's a recent case in the charity sector with a large cloud provider of fundraising software where that happened. So there are lots of different, as they call it, attack vectors. We've got our next survey here about who is responsible for data security in your organization. So it'd be very good briefly to understand a bit more about where responsibility lies in each organization. So we've got a few choices here, everything from IT department through to senior management. Maybe if we give this a moment and see what responses we get here. Oh, crikey. so the first one coming through, nobody. Perhaps not uncommon, actually. Unless it's actively managed, why would anybody be responsible for it necessarily? Clearly the IT department's a biggie here. Quite a few, by the looks of it, have got named information asset owners. So people who are nominated as individually being responsible for a particular pot of data in an organisation. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we've got quite a few of the data protection officer. So it's a bit of a spread, isn't it? So yeah, we've got a few committees coming through there. So yeah, I think that's probably stabilising now. So interesting. I mean, the thing that's striking me from those results there is, the IT department is right up there, but also various committees, and fairly even spread among users, senior managers, data protection officer, and so on. And I think that kind of leads us into some of the common misconceptions with this. So, we often hear organisations say, well, actually it's, the IT department needs to take care of this. We need them to do the pen testing and make sure our firewalls are set up properly and everything. And of course, that's simply not true. The IT department has a crucial role to play in all of this, but everybody uses data and information. It's a broad corporate risk for most organisations. I mentioned about penetration tests, kind of like simulated hacking to test the defences of an organisation. One of the things that we found is that, of course, that is very important. The technical controls need to be in place to make sure that there's no obvious way in for automated attacks. But management controls, especially, have a role to play. So things like having clear procedures for sharing data with third parties, having adequate training for users so they're less likely to make certain types of mistakes. Having if you imagine almost like a sort of organizational risk register, sort of identifying the sorts of areas that could go wrong and the things that you would do on a non-technical basis to try and prevent some of those from happening. There are many, and I think David will be coming on to those in a bit. We mentioned about hackers only going for big, well-funded organizations. Usually, malware attacks and so on are, as we know, indiscriminate. I mentioned about who with a conscience would attack a sort of honest small to medium-sized business. Again, it doesn't matter. You can get into any of them. And then the other one that we see a lot of is particularly where organizations are tendering for work, or in the charity sector applying for funding. They'll get asked lots of questions about how do you hold our data securely, and very often we'll see responses along the lines of, while our servers are in an ISO 27001 accredited tier 3 data center, you think, yeah, that means the data center may well have some good controls in place, but what about you as the organization? There are lots of chains, and the data center is just one thing. What about how the applications are set up themselves? What about how users are handling the data? What about the procedural controls within the organization? So there are many of these misconceptions, many of which can be handled through training. And in relation to that, this is where responsibilities come in. So we asked the question about who has responsibility in your organization for data security. We usually find that the answer comes back as IT, mostly. But if we take the view that everybody has a role to play in this, we could argue, right at the corporate risk level, the finance director or operations director should be covering, the broad categories of risk and making sure that responsibilities have been allocated for keeping systems up to date and sort of implementing the various controls. Obviously a data protection officer or a data protection lead has a major role to play in all of this. People that actually do the work day to day, that was my favorite one here, and probably actually the best first line of defense. If people are sort of handling data in a secure way, they're being mindful not to collect more information than they need. They're not trying to save things locally to their hard disks, or copying things onto USB sticks for convenience, or going down the route of shadow IT and popping things on cloud-based file sharing services because it's an easy way of accessing their work from home or things like that. This, starting with users, can of course have a massive impact, but that does of course require organizational commitment to it, and it requires, particularly if we're in the IT team, it requires the rest of the organization to be giving us that legitimacy to go and have those conversations more broadly with everybody, or perhaps not even having those conversations directly, but having that security initiative led from somewhere else in the organization, with IT providing a technical input to all of that, rather than necessarily being the risk owner. I'm going to hand over to David at this point, who's going to take us through a few of the frameworks and a few of the starting points, and then we'll come on to Q&A.
Okay, just let me get my screen shared. Oh. There we go. Can you see my screen now? Yes, can you see it, Paul?
Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah, thank you.
Great. So yeah, okay, the obligatory reference to Monty Python, which you have to in every IT focused event. But yeah, GDPR, data protection is not what we're talking about today, of course, but it's a core part of information security and cybersecurity, because obviously it's data that's the risk. If there was no data, there'd be no risk for cybersecurity anyway. And data protection law, as you all know, relates to personal data. Again, there's large chunks of data that can be stolen that aren't personal. But what GDPR has helped us all do, I think, and organizations generally around the EU and more widely, is to understand our data better, even where it's not personal data, but certainly for personal data. It's forced various rules and regulations on organizations that they probably should have had anyway, but they haven't by and large. And so from that point of view, I think it's been really useful. There have been some issues with it. Of course, any standard like this is going to be not entirely appropriate for everybody, and it's going to work better in some contexts than it does in others. But Paul's already talked about governance and accountability. GDPR has forced organizations to recognize data owners, and certainly in my experience, it's been quite difficult to get senior staff in organizations to recognize that they're responsible for large pots of data. They like to sort of push it down the line to the individuals who maybe input the data or manage it, but actually it needs to be owned at a high level in an organization. And that's been a good change, a good improvement in the way organizations manage their data and take responsibility for it. Training, again, Paul has mentioned, this is one of my particular bugbears actually when it comes to both cybersecurity and data protection, is that training, individual staff training, the frontline staff training, tends to be very tokenistic. It's, in my experience, it's all about, well, what can we do cheaply? And we can do it once every 3 years. It won't cost us much, and we've ticked that box. There is some really, really bad cybersecurity training out there, which is purely tick box stuff, which is not worth the little money one has to pay for it, and which you might well not do because it just bores the staff. Staff don't take it seriously. They resent having to spend half an hour doing it once every 2 or 3 years. And as I say, it doesn't win on any front. It doesn't really save you money. It certainly doesn't help an organization fight the many risks around cybersecurity that we've already discussed today. So one of the few things I would say I really would like organizations to take away from today is the fact that your organization should be investing significant or appropriate amounts of money in training for all staff. Any member of staff has any kind of access to the internet, which might not be all staff, but it's going to be the majority of them. And there is good training out there. They're not all the same. Do a good search and test. And it needs to be training that's a combined sort of package of evaluations. So you can do some benchmarking. You can see where improvements might be. You need an organization that will do some simulated phishing for you. So you can, again, see where improvements are happening. So you do a simulated phishing attack before you've done some training, and then do it again afterwards and see if things have improved. And you need to tie your training in with your policies, and ideally have the policies as part of the online training, so that people can show that they've read the policies and done the training and had a test after each training course to show that they've actually they didn't sleep through it or watch telly on their mobiles whilst they should have been doing the training. So I really would push that, push for evaluating the training, look for some decent training. There is some good training out there, and there's a lot of not very good training out there. And it's the end users who are the weakest point. You know, it's easy to look at technology, and it's important to look at technology. But as I think our earlier word cloud showed, you know, it's users, it's awareness that are the big risks. And one of the best ways to tackle that is through training, policies as well. But we all know, again, that it's very hard to get people to read and fully take in what might be quite long and jargon-ridden policies around data and security. You can try and make them better as well, and make sure people do read them. But I think training is the big weakness in many organizations that that we work with, certainly. Getting your documentation, policies and procedures right. I mean, again, GDPR has helped with that. It's forced organizations that previously might not have taken this too seriously, forced them to have some of these policies and procedures in place. Be pragmatic about it, and I'm going to come on to some risk reduction issues later. You know, you cannot be 100% safe. I would say that it's a bit like your front door. You know, what kind of lock do you have on your front door? Well, it's not going to be the same as at the local bank, but it's going to be slightly better than your garden shed. It's going to be somewhere in between, and you'll decide how much you spend on the lock for your front door, and you'll base that on various risks and what's in your house. And it's the same with cybersecurity. We all know what the risks are. If you're only going to keep your front door on a cheap padlock, then you know, you take those risks, and you have to live with them. Likewise with cybersecurity, have the policies and procedures in place, but be pragmatic about it. If you try to lock everything down to the nth degree so that you're as safe as Fort Knox, so to speak, you'll never get there. You'll be chasing your tail, and you'll be spending vast amounts of money, and probably it'll be counterproductive in the end. Now, consent and lawful basis, very much GDPR and data protection issues, you might think not particularly related to cybersecurity, but they do have a connection, a quite an important connection, in fact, because one thing that GDPR has forced organizations to do is to accept that there's a lot of data they hold that they probably oughtn't hold. They probably don't have a lawful basis for holding, particularly if they've held it for quite a long time. And the one thing that significantly reduces your cybersecurity risk is not having the data. You know, if using, again, our not-for-profit examples, if you have a fundraising database for 1 million people, in the past, that might have been seen as a great KPI, and you might have got rewarded by the trustees because you're regularly mailing fundraising asks to 1 million people. But actually, unbeknownst to your trustees, 750,000 of those just bounce back because they're no longer valid email addresses, or they're people who have moved on, or people who are no longer interested in your organization. If you have those 1 million bits of data stolen, that's a major breach. Why not get rid of the stuff you don't need? You know, it's true across charities and other organizations. It's not only it's a good idea to get rid of it, now it's a legal responsibility to get rid of it. You have to have a robust retention policy. Make sure you're not keeping data any longer than you have to, particularly the more sensitive data. There was I think it was Washington Metropolitan Police Force recently had quite a big data breach where a lot of very sensitive data about individual police officers was stolen and was passed around on the dark web. You know, and a lot of that data was quite old apparently, and didn't need to have been kept by them, and certainly shouldn't have been kept in such a place as it could easily be downloaded by hackers. So if you can reduce the data you've got, you're naturally going to reduce your risks. So a decent, robust retention policy followed through. It's easy to write them. It's not so easy to follow them through. You know, if you say that data is about members or customers has to be deleted 2 years after your last interaction with them, then someone's got to make sure that happens. You need to have IT systems that will, for instance, every month will list all the people for whom that two years is up and say, right, do you want to delete them all? And it gets done. So you need to put in place not just a retention policy, but actually a strategy for delivering on it. IT security is an integral part of GDPR. GDPR says that you have to have appropriate technical and organizational measures. As usual in so much law, it's very woolly, and it's very hard to say what is appropriate technical and organizational measures. A lot of that may well come out in due course in case law, but it's clear again that you need to be pragmatic. It has to be appropriate. Like my example of the lock on your front door, you have to have the right measures for you and the right measures for the sort of data you have. If you've got very little personal data or very little sensitive data at all, then maybe you wouldn't mind if someone hacked your systems and took away all your data. You might think, well, that's fine. I'm very happy for everyone to see the data we've got. And that would be fine, in which case you probably don't need to be spending vast amounts of money on security. For most organizations, I guess, I'm sorry, that's my dog needing his supper. hopefully somebody else will deal with that rather than me, but that's good, is gone. But yeah, IT security has got to be appropriate, and it's got to be at the right level for your organization. And for that to happen, the organization has to be thinking about it, has to be making those decisions. It can't just be left to the IT department, for instance, to decide what is an appropriate level of security. That has to be an organization-wide decision, and it has to be a decision that is accepted right at the highest level, at board level. You know, the board might not make that decision, but they need to know about it, and they need to understand what decisions have been made on their behalf. I think making sure that the board understand data again is really important. As something GDPR has pushed. It's still I think a battle to be fought for many organisations, but I think many more, certainly in the charity sector, many more trustee boards are now much more accepting of their responsibilities around data, and hopefully that's true also in the non-charity sector. Making sure everyone understands supplier and processor responsibilities. This is another interesting area, I think, because again, I think this was quite a gap up until GDPR, because one of the biggest risks we have is not our own systems and data, but those of our suppliers and processors. No organizations operate in complete isolation these days. All organizations that we work with and belong to have other suppliers. It's the nature of the way we operate these days, and it's very easy to think, well, I don't need to worry about that data because I've outsourced it to so and so, or my mailing is all done by this mailing house, or my events are all managed by that company. But you are still responsible, and if they have your data, then you have a right to know how they look after it, where it's stored, what systems they use, and under GDPR, of course, you have the right to audit that and to go and actually see it and make sure your data is being looked after appropriately. Contracts are changing, and that's all good stuff. You know, people are having to say in contracts what they do, and hopefully that forces them to actually do what they say. It doesn't always, but I think the big strength of GDPR has been to actually make all this something that people talk about, and even sort of, you know, the person on the street has heard about GDPR, or they think they have anyway. They think they know about the right to be forgotten and various other bits and pieces, and I think that's all good stuff. People know that they have rights over their data, and therefore they hold all organisations that might hold their data. They hold them to high standards, and we have to accept that. We have to make sure that all the organisations that we represent honour those standards. So how do we manage that data? This is where GDPR and cybersecurity to some extent sort of coalesce, because as we've said earlier, it's not just an IT issue. Data is, as an organisation-wide issue. There are elements of it that IT has to help with, but at the bottom there, we have the data culture. And that, I think, is the hardest thing to sort of to clarify within any organisation. Understanding how people look after data, how important bits of data are, and the respect people have for data. If an organisation holds personal data, they must respect that. It's a human rights issue as much as anything else. If my data is being held by Amazon, for instance, then they have a duty to look after my data. And any organisation that holds somebody else's data has that. And you have to build within the organisation a culture that respects those rights of all the individuals you hold, whether they're your customers, whether they're your members, whether they're your donors. It's really important. And you embed that culture through having an architecture, a structure for your data that everyone understands, knowing where your data is, knowing what systems it's kept on, trying to make sure there aren't numerous spreadsheets around with bits of data on them, making sure your data is all in one place, if possible, one system, so that you have a single version of the truth, and understanding how it's broken down. Unless you have a decent data architecture and procedures, you will never be able to achieve your data retention policy, because you won't be able to find your data to get rid of it. I was working with a small charity the other day, or reasonably small charity, and they'd had an email from somebody saying they were really, really pissed off at getting the newsletter every month, and they never wanted to see it again. And they looked on their mailing list, and that person wasn't on it. And so there was slight panic in the organisation, because the next mailing was coming around, and they couldn't find where that person's name was. They must have been on a system somewhere, and they were eventually found on a spreadsheet somewhere in the organization. And as a result of being on that spreadsheet, they were getting the mailings. But if you've got lots of different sources of your data, it's very hard to find the right stuff and make sure you understand where your data is, and you've got just each bit of data there once rather than twice or three times. Securing your data, we talk a lot. I mean, there's some. I've got a link later to a DCMS survey on cybersecurity that came out recently, showing that I think 32% of large organizations still have desktops with out-of-date versions of Windows 7 and below. That's a huge amount, 32%. And broadly over all organizations, it's still 20%. And that's slightly frightening, since those versions of Windows are no longer secure, they're no longer supported. So although we have said that data security is an awful lot more than just getting your technology right, there is a core thing around getting the technology right that should be, in many ways, the simplest part of cybersecurity. It should be relatively straightforward. We all know, those of us that work in technical jobs, that it isn't always that straightforward, because there are so many dependencies, and there may well be systems that just don't work on later versions of Windows or whatever, and therefore it's much harder. I know the NHS has huge problems. They have massive, great millions of pounds worth of MRI scanners that only work on Windows XP. And what do? You can't throw out all your MRI scanners just because Windows has been updated. And I think it can be a real problem, particularly in larger organizations. Interestingly, the DCMS survey showed that utilities companies are particularly bad at this as well, which maybe points back to why the Colonial Pipeline disaster happened. A lot of these big utilities companies, again, are very reliant on old operating systems, but getting them sorted, getting them out of the way, really important. If there are dependencies on other systems, then you just have to work as hard as possible and create a roadmap for getting out of that situation. There are all sorts of technical things we can do to protect ourselves. Something I was going to do here actually is show you a map that I always find rather both frightening and interesting. This, I don't know if you can see that. I'm not sure if I'm sharing just the my screen or just the slides, but if I'm showing my screen, then that's the Kaspersky real-time map of cyber threats, which shows you exactly what's happening in real time. Can you see that, Paul? Or is it still on the slides? Yeah.
Yeah, can see that.
That's looking, actually, that's quieter than it normally is when I look at it, but you can see where the main problems are coming from and where they're aimed at as well. You can look at that many, many times over and over again, and I do more than I probably ought to. But it just gives you a sense of all the different threats that are going on as we speak. So for those of you that say you've never had an attack, I think you may never have had an attack that was noticed or that was recorded, but I think basically if you have a system of any sort that's attached to the internet, then it will have been attacked, most definitely. And if one day someone will get through it, it's a bit like wandering down the street trying all the car doors. People do that because they know eventually they'll come across one that someone's failed to lock. And when it comes to IT, someone is trying your car door every second of the day. So there are technical things, there are firewalls, there are penetration tests. Paul mentioned that earlier, often seen as a sort of silver bullet, but they're not, sadly. But they are a sort of basic thing that you can get right. You can get right and move on. The technical stuff is good, but it's not sufficient on its own. The NCSC, you probably all of you come across the National Cyber Security Centre, really, really useful resource for all sorts of data about cybersecurity. This 10 steps has been around for, I think, over a decade now. They update it occasionally, but there's a lot of information. There's a really good document about cybersecurity for small businesses and charities. There's a useful stuff just in the last week or two about passwords. A lot of interesting, useful stuff. Again, if you don't, I would immediately get on their mailing list or connect up to them on LinkedIn, because lots of useful stuff comes through from NCSC. But that 10 steps is one of their core bits of resource that, as I say, has been around a long time, and all useful stuff. Really useful documents for sharing with boards and non-IT staff, because I think they write them quite well, and it's clear and it's easy for people to understand, I think. A lot of the stuff they recommend are these things, and these are the basics. These are things you need to do, and you need to do regularly. Enforce it. Passwords are something people often talk about. For instance, changing of passwords regularly. Well, the NCSC now recommends that you don't force people to change their passwords. Much better to force strong passwords and then not force people to change them unless they believe that they've been compromised in one way or another. But strength of passwords really important, and changing default passwords. We've hear so many stories of people leaving backdoors in systems because there's a default password that came with their firewall or their server or whatever, and no one's bothered changing it, or unused service accounts that have been created years ago in IT for doing a particular job, and then someone forgot about them and they just sat there in the background until someone came along and, again, with like car analogy, they tried the door and it was open. So make sure you regularly do a spring clean of all the service accounts and all passwords. Really ramp up password difficulty, but don't force people to change. Implementing two-factor authentication, again, absolute standard. Hopefully it's something that you all do already. Most systems now allow it. If you're looking at systems and they don't allow it, then I would suggest that's a good reason not to use them. Paul's already mentioned backups, making sure they're not part of your system, because if they are, then they'll be infected with ransomware just like everything else. Training users, I've mentioned at the beginning, I think really important. Most of this stuff, as I say, you probably all do already, but you'll be surprised how often it's these basic things that cause the problems. The standards, again, we've mentioned briefly. They're all useful. Cyber Essentials is probably the most useful sort of basic standard that, again, all organizations should be getting. It doesn't, if you've got Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus, it doesn't mean you can't be hacked or that you're not at risk, but it does mean you've ticked off some of the basics. And it's a good way of having a sort of audit. If you go for Cyber Essentials Plus, at least, having an audit, an external party who's looked at your systems and said, okay, yes, you pass muster at the moment. The others, ISO 27001, PCI DSS, and I threw in the NHS one there, not because it may be necessarily useful to all of you, but these are all interesting and useful standards to have a look at. You may not decide to go for them, like 27001. It's a complex and can be quite a lengthy process to get that standard, but it's useful just to look at it and download it and see what's in there. You can use a lot of the data in these standards without actually having to achieve the standard, and gain from all of them. So they're all worth looking at. But Cyber Essentials, like I say, is probably the most important one. It's a good bottom line. Any organization really ought to have it, and it should be a logo that you proudly have on the website. And again, more and more people, I think, are looking at sites and organizations and saying, well, if they haven't got Cyber Essentials, then they probably haven't got the house in order. And it's not that expensive to get. You can if you just do the basics, you can self classify yourself. It's worth getting it audited externally and getting the Cyber Essentials Plus, but even that's not a hugely expensive task, and it's well worth investigating. ISO 27001, like I say, a bit more complex. Sometimes contracts and business insist on organizations having it. Other times it's just a useful one to be aware of. It's certainly useful in your suppliers and in your data centers and things, trying to make sure that they've all got 27001 if possible. Again, it gives you some reassurance. Doesn't mean totally safe. PCI DSS is really about payment card industry, about their standards. So obviously it's not relevant if you don't store payment card data on your systems, but if you do, you have to have it. So it's worth understanding if you're thinking about storing credit card data. But let's come on to, I've talked once or twice about a pragmatic risk-based approach. This is because, like I say, you can't get rid of all risks. Whatever happens, there is going to still be a risk out there. It's like an arms race. You know, the better we get at defending ourselves, the better the bad guys get at attacking us, and that's not going to stop any time quickly. So what you have to do is look at your cybersecurity risks within the broader context of an organization's risk strategy. Again, take it out of IT, look at it in terms of the organizational risk strategy. Data risk and cyber risk should be there with all the other risks that the organization has to deal with and mitigate. And look at how you best reduce or get rid of those risks. And there are all sorts of ways of doing it, but it's worth focusing on the most important ones. The risks that are most likely to cause damage, most likely to happen, the high probability, high impact risks. There's no point spending a vast amount of time or money on the ones that are might be high risk but low probability, or vice versa. Aim at the sort of the red and yellow areas in the table at the bottom there, things that score high on both, and focus an organization, because otherwise you just get lost in a vast array of different risks and different things you need to sort out, and you're penetration testing every single thing that moves in the organization if you're not careful. Get the organization to think about all the risks and then group them, rank their probability and impact, and then work out, you know, whether you can terminate or treat or transfer or tolerate. Often you have to tolerate, but you can mitigate risks. You can even insure. Sometimes insurance can help. If you have a major data breach, it can be useful to have an insurance policy that provides some support and some forensic help to work out what's happened and tidy things up afterwards. But it certainly won't stop you having the risk in the first place. But it's very important to make sure this is part of the organizational strategy rather than just an IT thing. But very quickly, we have a guide to information security. I don't know if that's already been circulated, but it's available on our website, and we can provide, there's a link to it on this slide, which you'll be getting anyway. And there's some useful resources. Some of the stuff we've already talked about, like the NCSC Cyber Essentials, the breaches survey I mentioned earlier, and confusingly, in the States they have an NCSC as well, but it's not the same. But they have some useful resources on their website as well. That takes us. Sorry, I rushed, but I hope that gives us time to have some questions afterwards.
No, thank you, David, and thank you, Paul, as well. That was very interesting to understand what the data is, where we are, and obviously there's risks, isn't it? Just conscious of the time, but I'm sure we can at least get one question in. So we discussed about, you mentioned about obviously people, staff being the best line of defense, and then David, you mentioned about training. Would you be able to sort of recommend some sort of staff training, specific recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, obviously at Adapter we are totally independent, so we're not aligned to anybody. We're not there's no training that we are particularly linked to or anything. But I do sometimes help clients identify good training, and I do at the moment the one I rate most in terms of the online training that I've come across, and I'm sure there are other good ones as well, is the Bob's Business training, which is the only one I think that is also recommended by the NCSC. So it's not just me, but Bob's Business they have a really good training package. It's called their culture package because it doesn't just focus on the training, but also it does what I mentioned earlier. It's quite engaging, and it's training that people I think would get something out of. It wouldn't just be a tick box exercise, all involving scored tests afterwards, and regular phishing and other benchmarking as well. So Bob's Business is good, but there are other good ones as well, I know, but there are also other very poor ones. So have a look at that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Called Bob's Business, someone's asking.
Bob's,
it's
yeah,
not
Bob.
run by Bob, it's run by Melanie. But for some reason, she chose Bob.
Brilliant. Thank you both for that very interesting talk. And I'm sure we all got something out of it, and we can use that in our daily lives, plus in our work environments as well. So great. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining as well. I'm going to now end this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.